Hello, and welcome to the Rough Edges podcast with Sarah I. Fox. In this podcast, I will guide you through my faith and mental health journey to dispel the stigma surrounding mental illness and to create an empowering resource for those who wish to discover more about these topics. I pray that this podcast will not only bless you, but that it will bring growth and healing to our communities. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Rough Edges. We are continuing our men's mental health series, and I am so excited to introduce my guest, Warrington Chapman. Warrington Chapman is a man of God who is passionate about raising awareness about the benefits of therapy, particularly for men's mental health. Warrington attained a Bachelor of the Arts in History from City College of New York and a Bachelor of Science in Pre-Medical Studies from Medgar Evers College. He currently works as a police officer for the New York Police Department in the transit sector. Warrington's passion is to not only raise awareness about men's mental health in faith-based communities, but to continue creating safe spaces for men to speak out about their mental health in the church. I know him as Sammy, so that's how I'm going to be referring to him for the rest of the interview, but I'm so happy to have him on. Welcome, Sammy.
Hey, how are you? How's everything?
I'm good. So thank you so much for being on the podcast with me. I want to start off by asking, what are 3 things that motivate you on a daily basis and why?
Hmm, 3 things. I mean, the main thing that motivates me, honestly, is getting paid. That's what gets me out the bed because I gotta pay rent, I gotta pay bills. I gotta, make sure the lights stay on and whatnot. But if I had to choose 2 more, I would probably say being a good example for my nieces and making my mother proud. That's probably the 3 things I could probably tell you.
Oh, I love that. I love the last 2. And then the first one is very relatable and valid. So like that's also a motivator for me too to get out of bed every day and go to work. So yeah, I definitely empathize with that. So we are talking about men's mental health. And
Yes.
before we dive into this topic, I wanted to know a little bit more about you, specifically your faith journey and how that's
Mhm.
impacted your life. So can you share more about your faith journey?
Sure. So I was, born and raised in the church. I got saved at a very young age, around like 6 years old, but at that time, you don't really know the ins and outs of what it really means to be saved. I would probably say about the age of 14, I got baptized and I was started in the ministry. And when I got to college, I think that's when I had a personal like journey. And I said, I want to know why I believe what I believe. I want to know why I worship Jesus instead of any other thing. And I had to make the Bible true for me. I had to make, Christ true for me. And I had a journey and along the way, you realize like, I know why Jesus is the true God. You know what I mean? So it's like, so that helped me a lot. And it helped to, with a lot of grounding for a day-to-day life. So a lot of times things happen, you come across things at work or, just things in life in general. And your first thought will probably be like panic. And, but then afterwards you realize, oh no, I serve a really big God. This is the same God that when Daniel was in the lions, then he shut the mouths of the lions. It's the same God that parted the Red Sea. So I know he's gonna come through for me somehow. So and then it's like so it reverts your mind to prayer. And then, so you go straight to prayer. And I'm not gonna lie, I do it 100% of the time. No, it's not always the first thing on my mind, but there's always something that brings you back to that point and it recalibrates you on like almost to like, all right, you know what? Let me stop trying to work this out myself. Let me go to Jesus. And that's how I think, my faith has helped me throughout these years.
Yes, that is amazing. And one of the things that I really appreciated about what you shared is that even in the darkest moments of your life, like faith is a grounding aspect of life for you. And I agree with that because one of the things that I love to incorporate about faith on the podcast is that faith can give you the hope that you need to be able to go through life struggles, especially when it
Absolutely.
comes to like health and, psychology and those
Yes.
sides of things as well. So thank you for sharing that. So as I mentioned earlier, like we're talking about men's mental health. So what are your thoughts on the stigma surrounding men expressing their emotions and seeking help for their mental health?
Well, the stigma that I know is that, when men share things about their mental health, it almost seems as if they're like weak or soft, or why you telling anybody anyway? Like, just dust it off, man up, and just keep going. I've had that mindset for a while. So it's like I'm well aware of that stigma because I was part of that, but there's nothing wrong with seeking mental health. There's nothing wrong with seeking outside help for that. Because the more you hold on to things, you can really make yourself sick. And, but that stigma of, nah, you're a man, you're supposed to be tough, whatever, dust it off and just keep going. That does have some benefits and some truth to it. It also is very damaging. And I've been on the receiving end of that. I've experienced it. So I can honestly say, like, the stigma is very damaging in some cases.
Yeah, I agree. And you mentioned that you experienced it yourself. So, what was that experience like in seeking support for your mental health? And how did you overcome any difficulties with that?
Well, I would say it was a pretty trying time. And I feel like I was on a hamster wheel, to say. And it got to a point where, I didn't really have a desire to do anything. I didn't have a desire to even like, get out of bed. I didn't want to do any of that. But I didn't want to tell anybody because, I'm a man. I'm supposed to be tough and just brush it off and just keep going. And I did that, even though I didn't want to get out of bed or go to work and do this or do that. I just kind of forced myself to do it because I'm supposed to do it, but there'll be days when I would be off and I would just lay in my bed all day. You know what I mean? And it's like not knowing that those were like the undertones of depression and all those type of things. Not to say that I wasn't like brushing my teeth or showering or stuff like that, but it was to a point where I got a little secluded and I kind of just like alienated myself a little bit. I didn't really want to, be around anybody. So I kind of just bottled in all those things. And then, you start to feel yourself for some reason, like you just feel heavy, like you're just walking around with a whole bunch of weight.
Mm.
And it's not until I decided that I was going to talk to a third party who doesn't know me from a hole in the wall. 'Cause I think at that time I just wanted to hear from someone who would tell me what I wanted to hear. I feel like a third party, a neutral party, is just what I needed. And it was probably the best thing I could do. It was a little rough at first because, like, why am I talking to you? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was on the BetterHelp app. I remember what surprised me is that they paired me. They ask you who you want to be paired with, a man, woman, whether your religion or not. I didn't care. I just needed to talk to somebody.
Hmm.
And they actually paired me with a Christian guy who was also a pastor. And he was very patient and he kind of like helped me to learn to open up a little bit. And he told me, like, even though you're opening up, you can still maintain your masculinity at the same time. You can still be a man. You can still be in control of your emotions. You can still learn how to, deal with when those thoughts start to rise up and, how to deal with those and how to navigate through it. And that was probably one of the best experiences I've had because I see the fruit of it, as a result.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that you said really stuck out to me that you mentioned that your therapist shared with you in knowing that you can still maintain your masculinity, like your essence of who you are as a man, and still go to therapy. I think that it's so simple, but it's also like a revolutionary thing because a lot of
Yeah.
the time, like men think they have to sacrifice some part of their manhood if they're talking about their emotional health and like other things that
No,
affect them.
it's true because one thing, I'm sorry if I'm going off topic, but he mentioned a lot about like King David. King David was, he wrote a lot of the Psalms. And he's like, when you read the Psalms, he said, you see this man is pouring out his emotions. He's pouring out his feelings,
Hmm.
but at the end of the day, his feelings and everything is still pointing back to God, reorchestrating everything. And yet David was still a warrior. David was still a warrior king. He was a man who was given the task to fight for Israel. You're fighting for the
Yeah.
kingdom of Israel. Yet he was still in charge, in control of his emotions. So you can still be a man and you can still express your emotions, and you don't have to separate the two. It's not
Right.
going to make you any less masculine because you're sharing how you feel. But one thing he did also say was knowing who and who not to share those information with, because there are some people who will weaponize that against you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably adds to the stigma of why a lot of men don't want to speak about their mental health, because not just the fear of, being looked at as less masculine, but also the fear of being judged by other people or being attacked for it, you know?
Yeah, I definitely understand that too. And there is like a fear that goes with it. And that's why it is important to be wise about who you share your innermost like experiences
Mm.
with. And I think that also goes into just the idea that you have to have that support system with you,
Yes.
because that will help you to be able to know, okay, who am I speaking to? Why do I want to talk to them? And can I build trust with this person? So that's
Hmm.
also very important.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to also touch on, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to pinpoint your relationship with mental health and faith. So did you ever struggle with the idea that having mental health issues or any type of mental health problem is indicative of a lack of faith? And how did you learn how to manage that feeling?
I did, because I always looked at it as if you shouldn't. I don't know. Maybe it was a very terrible way of thinking that, because you're saved, you shouldn't be depressed because you have Christ, So because
Mhm.
you have Christ, there's no reason why you should be depressed. No reason why you should. But then it's like you realize, no, you're still a human being in this body. Like,
Yeah.
you still have all those issues that still plague us. Christ is able to break every single type of bondage that you have. You also realize he placed doctors and people in place to also help you when it's needed. Not
Yeah.
to say that he needs help, but it's like, if it wasn't necessary, there will be no doctors, there will be no therapists.
Right.
You cannot
Right.
separate the two. And he will always point to verses of scripture here and there just to show, like, this is what depression will look like, or this is what anxiety will look like. And yes, you feel anxiety, and he gives you the practical aspects of how to deal with anxiety, and he gives you the practical aspects of how to deal with that depression that you're going through. But he also points you back to scripture, where scripture is telling you, be anxious for nothing, like, you still have to pray. So as the book of James says, faith without works is dead. So it's like, even though you're given those practical ways, you still have to incorporate prayer. And even though you have prayer, you still have to use those practical methods. So it's like you really can't separate the two. And I learned that. And it was like really eye opening. And I'm really glad I kind of figured that out sooner than later.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like the two, mental health and faith, they're not mutually exclusive. Like you said, you can't have one without the other, and they do work together to be able to help you achieve like better health for your body, your mind, your spirit. So I do appreciate you really coming to grasp about that, because it is very important, especially for people who do grow up in church and think because you're a Christian, you have to be exempt from life's problems, even though Christ himself was not exempt
True.
from suffering and life's problems. So, we as Christians, we have to put that in perspective. And I think I really love that your therapist also incorporates biblical truths, but also uses the psychological, like science and everything like that to
Hmm.
help. And it has, from what I'm hearing, it has been effective.
You're very effective.
Yeah, that's really awesome. And I wanted to share with you some statistics about men's mental health that comes from Self-Space, which is a mental
Mm.
health website. And it says 40% of men have never spoken to anyone about their mental health. 29% of those men say that they're too embarrassed to speak about it, while 20% also say that there is a negative stigma and that's why they don't talk about it either. What are your thoughts on these statistics, and have any of them rang true for you? Hello again. Before you dive into the rest of today's episode, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your support and for hitting that play button. If you want to expand on that support, here are 3 ways that you can do so. 1. Leave a review. If anything in today's episode resonated with you, or you would want to share about how the podcast changed your life, you can do so by leaving a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. 2. Check out our shop. The Rough Edges shop is a faith-based, women of color owned online shop where you can get a variety of products from tote bags, journals, t-shirts, and more. 20% of the proceeds go to a mental health organization. So check it out at roughedgespodcast.com/shop. 3. Connect on social media. Rough Edges is on a wide variety of social media platforms, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and more. If you want to connect outside of listening to the podcast episodes, you can do so on these platforms. If you have any questions, you can check out the episode description or stay to the end for more information. Now, enjoy your episode.
Well, I think I've experienced every one of those thoughts. Like I said, as men, you don't really share your feelings because nobody cares about your feelings. You know what I mean? So if you hurt, nobody's going to care. So just keep going. But there is also a negative stigma that you be labeled as soft or as less manly if you start sharing your feelings because that's what women do, quote unquote. That's what women do, And then it's like there's the people who are too embarrassed. Like I said, it's that fear of being judged, that fear of you sharing something very, very important and private with someone. And then somehow or another you end up hearing it somewhere. And now it's like you don't want to run the risk of somebody judging you for sharing those aspects about you. So I understand every single one of those thoughts that's listed here. I've literally like experienced every single one of those. So I was like, I fully understand it.
Yeah, and I can also imagine the type of pressure that can come with men actually not only acknowledging what they're going through on like an emotional and psychological level, but also having to come to terms with this is something that I need to deal with in order to make my life a little bit better for myself. But like you mentioned, it comes with that pressure of, okay, that's what women do. It's so amazing how it's passable or acceptable for women to manage their emotions, talk about their emotions, when men who are also human beings should have
Mhm.
that same freedom to do the
Exactly.
same. So, like, it's just amazing to me how these societal pressures can really put people in boxes and place expectations on
Very
people
true.
that are, like not
Very true.
helpful. So, in terms of like going into more depth about the notion of being like man enough or maintaining your masculinity while you're talking about your mental health, do you ever feel certain situations where you're not man enough because you want to take care of your mental health? And if so, how do you manage those moments when they come up?
Well, I would probably say in the beginning I did. Now more so I don't, but I share like when I first started, I felt like, like why am I doing this? Why am I doing it? Like nobody's supposed to be knowing what I'm feeling. Nobody cares about my feelings. Like supposed to just be strong and just suck it up. Just keep going. Nobody cares. You know what I mean? And it's like, but it's again, like I said, it's dangerous to think that way because you do make yourself sick because it's like a hamster wheel of just negative thoughts just rolling around in your head. You have some like some negative affirmations, some negative self-talk, a whole bunch of things that can really bring you down. And then it's like something might be going on and you start playing scenarios in your head a million
Mhm.
times. And, it can really be detrimental. Sometimes you have to speak to someone about those things. And it's not until you actually do put your pride to the side and then you actually do seek professional help that you realize like, oh, okay, yeah, this is actually very necessary.
Yeah, I definitely like understand that. And I was also curious about another aspect of this because growing up, at least for me, growing up in the Black community, especially in a Caribbean household,
Hmm.
everything is like solved with like prayer and herbs, right? Like,
Go drink
we
some
don't,
bush tea.
right. Like we don't do like mental health or therapy
Mm,
and talking our family business. So I
mm.
was curious to know, like, have you ever, like, in wanting to go to therapy, have you ever like wrestled with those thoughts and like fears that were impressed upon you by like your community or like family history? And how did you navigate that?
Well, not necessarily. I think growing up in the household that I did, we didn't really experience that part of the Caribbean. You know,
Yeah.
granted, you have a little cough, yeah, go rub some Vicks and drink some bush tea and stuff like that. But I think the house that I grew up in, we were pretty open. I was able to talk to my mother about a lot of different issues. I mean, there were still some things that I wasn't really comfortable with sharing with her, but for the most part, my mother was very present
Mm.
and she would listen and she would give her little advice and stuff like that. So that notion of going to therapy wasn't really like a hindrance in terms of like my family and stuff like that. Nah, not really. But I know it is in like the black community. The black community, again, like they share those same sentiments of, why are you doing that?
Hmm.
Like we don't do that. That's the other people's stuff. I don't care for that. All health is important and everything's connected. So it's like when your body is good, your mental is good, they translate into every single facet of your life. So again, one can't work without the other. You can't have a strong body and a weak mind. So it's like
Hmm.
they both have to be strong in a sense for you to continue walking as you should.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm glad that you grew up in a household that was open about those things. Because again, you could also have like the flip side of that, where it's like, hey, we don't air out our family business. Like,
Mhm,
we don't need to be doing that. Or like you said, that's other people's stuff. Like, we don't do
mhm,
that. So I'm glad that you had like a household that encouraged those open conversations. So I did want to also talk about the church community again,
mhm,
because I know that you and I, well, we're in the same like church and everything.
mhm.
So with all of that, do you feel as if your church creates a safe space for men to talk about their mental health? And in what ways can your church create those safe spaces if they don't have those already?
I think now the church is there. I think now they have these different like young men's meetings and stuff like that where I guess the older generation is trying to help out the younger generation. And I've noticed it's a lot more open in terms of like sharing how you feel. Like I know like growing up in the church, the generation before this one, this was not a topic of conversation.
Hmm.
But as everything evolves, everything changes. And I guess with the changes, the leadership of the church realized like, yo, this is an aspect that we should cater to. And again, with the stigma, it's still a little rough for like a lot of young men to open up about those issues. But the fact that the door is there, the space is there, and that the leadership of the church is willing to listen, and willing to help, and willing to lend advice in that area, I feel like is great. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And sometimes I'm not gonna say like, oh, there was this when I was. Nah, it doesn't matter. The fact is, it's here now.
Yeah.
It's here now, and I'm grateful that it's here because now it's like again, it's a different era. And I'm glad they have that space there where they can share openly about those things and without the fear of being judged or being chastised or publicly humiliated in that respect. So I think the church is doing a good job right now in terms of that.
Yeah, that's good. And I'm glad to hear that. Like, especially that you guys have a safe space that you can be able to talk about these pressing issues. And I also love what you said about the generational shift. And I think like you see that now more than ever, especially when it comes to like things that are actually epidemics now. Like mental health is
Hmm.
definitely on the rise, like especially in today's generation. And while we still have a long way to go in terms of like getting the older generations on board, I feel like there is a shift happening in terms of
Yes.
getting people more comfortable about talking about these issues. And I'm happy to
Hmm.
hear that your church is able to institute that as well, because that is a huge component, especially in faith-based communities, that we need to
Absolutely.
tap into for sure.
Hmm.
Yeah, and so we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I just want to hone in a little bit more about the church community specifically and why men might feel a little bit uncomfortable, especially considering biblical roles of like, masculinity and everything. So, what are some factors do you think that can cause men in the church to be uncomfortable with speaking out about their mental health? And how do you think that this could start to be addressed more?
Well, I know for one, men are called to be the leaders, the leaders, especially leaders of the house, and things of that nature. And I know maybe if somebody's struggling with mental health and they're called to be a leader, maybe they feel like they're not capable of leading properly because of this. Maybe if I was to tell people that, oh, I'm struggling with depression or anxiety or whatever other thing it might be, they might be looked at as not fit to really be a leader since you're supposed to be in control of everything and all of that stuff. So that's probably the one that's really sticking out to me right now in terms of like factors. I think some other factors could probably be like in the home or whatever. They might feel like they're probably not fit to be the leader of their household as they should because of this thing. Maybe their wife might not look at them, the same way because, oh, you're suffering with this mental illness. They might feel like their significant other or their wife might look at them differently. Or maybe they might feel like they're letting their kids down some way, shape, or form. But what in reality, seeking help is probably the best thing that you can do, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most definitely. And I like that you touched on the leadership aspect of men in the church, because I know that is also kind of like a stigma in of itself of what like a leader should look like, especially in the
Mm,
church. And you also mentioned like being a leader in your family. Like there's this perception that you have to have it all together, like you have to take on all the responsibilities of the
hmm
household and not really like succumb to the pressure of taking care of all of that and then also taking care of yourself. So there
hmm
are a lot of layers to it, and I'm glad that you brought all of those factors up. And I also think that a way that this could be addressed is to have like more support in the church,
mm,
especially for leaders who
true,
could be able to help the congregation if they're helped as well. So I feel like
true.
if maybe, I don't know what this will look like practically, but like having some type of support system for leaders in the church so that they could be able to be open to talk about their struggles as leaders, you know?
I think something that just came to my mind as well is like burnout.
Yeah.
Burnout is a real thing. Like, and I'm not saying it to say like you treat your position in church as a job, but at some point it's always good to take a step back with everything. And that burnout leads into a lot of those feelings that do develop. And I think one of the things that could help is as like on the team, you have backups. You
Mm-hmm.
know, when the starters play for a certain number of plays, they sit out. There's somebody else who goes in, who fills in for a time, and then the starter comes back. You know what I mean? And I feel like if there was something along those lines, I feel like that could probably be the start of something better.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you feel you get into a point where it's like, listen, I'm not gonna lie, I'm getting a little burnt out. Is it okay if I just a step away for a little bit? Cool, it's no problem. We got so and so here. He's waiting in the wings. We're gonna put him in. We're gonna elevate him a little bit, and then when it's time, we're gonna bring you back. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And I feel like that kind of helps a lot too, because a lot of times when those feelings of burnout happens, it affects like a lot of different aspects, not just in your church, but also in the house and a whole bunch of other things. So it's like
Mhm.
even at work, because it trickles down and it
Right.
affects every single area. So I feel like once we're able to learn to take a step back and sometimes saying no, I feel like that can be the start of, you know, addressing a lot of those issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said about, well, you made the analogy of the starters and someone else coming in afterwards. Like, I feel like we've lost the value of rest also
Hmm.
as a society, because it's almost as if like resting is just so foreign to us that we almost feel like there's
You're
something
doing something
wrong.
wrong.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we have to rest. And I think that's another major component that, I mean, all people struggle with this, but I'm seeing that guys mostly struggle with, like, okay, I got to keep everything going. Everything has to, I have to keep it together and not really take that time to rest, which could also lead to burnout. So I'm
Yes.
glad that you brought that up too, because that's really important. So I also wanted to talk about the stigmas in the church's views of men's mental health. So if you could change one or two stigmas about how the church specifically views men's mental health, what would you change and why?
That's an interesting question. I'll probably say seeking help for your mental health is not a lack of faith.
Yeah.
I would probably leave with that one. And I would also say that seeking help is something that should be encouraged and not despised, especially as you say, like in a brotherhood. The churches, I feel like there's no camaraderie, there's no support
Mm-hmm.
for me. So it's like I think people need to realize that there are people out there who are willing to support you. Again, it's like you have to find those people who you trust completely. But the thing is, there are people there who are willing to help and support you. It's just a matter of being willing to speak to people and to make those connections so you can pinpoint those people who you can start to share a little more openly with.
Yeah. I agree with that for sure. And that's also an important thing about support that you don't really get a lot of times in the church. Don't get me wrong, like we're getting better and
Hmm.
like instituting these things. But I just remember growing up in church, it wasn't like it was a
It wasn't
time
a
for,
thing.
yeah, it really
It
wasn't
wasn't a
a
thing.
thing. It wasn't. And it's just like everybody tried to put on this happy face, this like
Hmm.
blessed and highly favored persona. And when really it's like you could be hurting inside and
You you
people
you
wouldn't
you you
know.
suffering silently.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we're getting better, but it really wasn't a thing, especially when I was growing up in church. And I'm sure you could attest to that too, like
Oh
growing
yeah.
up in church. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So what do you think are some helpful ways that we can start to encourage men, especially in the church, to speak out and seek help for their mental health?
I think the first thing is acknowledging that you're not alone in it. I'm thinking about Elijah when Elijah was running from Ahab and Jezebel, and he was like, "Oh, it's me. It's only me." And God basically said, "Listen, go take a nap. When you come back, you're gonna go here and you realize that there's a lot of people who feel the same way that you do. They're going through the same thing that you're going through.
Mm.
So, and I think once we can acknowledge the fact that everybody suffers with it, it's not just you, it's not just me. I think once we can break through that, I think that can be the start of the change. It's just acknowledging, like, okay, yeah, I know I'm not the only one. And it only takes that one person to say, listen, I know I'm not the only one who suffers with this and this. And then you realize, okay, somebody's gonna be like, oh, word, all right, cool. Let me go see what this is about. Let me go, and then believe it or not, you might actually start a movement that way.
Yeah.
It's just that one person. It takes that one person to take a step. It's usually like, especially when it's viewed as somebody from the top,
Yeah.
because it's like, oh wow, it usually gets a little more attraction when it's somebody from the top than just some regular guy. Now, I'm not saying that people in church are just regular people, but
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but what I mean is that when you see the leadership start to get a little more vulnerable, a little more open, and share those things, it's like, oh wow, okay, so I can share about stuff like that. Okay, great. And I think that's the main thing.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. Especially like you mentioned, like all it takes is like one or two people to say, me too. Like I
Hmm.
struggle with this particular thing. And I think once we get more comfortable about talking about it, it will definitely open the door for more and more people to start speaking out. And like you said, it could start a movement in the right
Yeah.
direction. So yeah, that's important. Well, Sammy, I want to thank you so, so much for joining me on the podcast. Before
Yes,
we
ma'am.
go, I have one final question for you. What
Hmm.
advice or words of encouragement do you have for men who struggle to manage or seek help for their mental health?
I would say there's no harm in seeking outside help. The same way you go to a doctor for your body, the same way you go to a dentist for your mouth, the same way you should go to a therapist for your mind. And also, seeking mental health can be one of the best things you can do. There's a lot of times we do have things from the past that we suppress, that sometimes they affect us in ways that we're unaware of. And sometimes when we go and we seek that help, we're able to deal with those issues. Maybe it's something internal, like in the family, that we can't really address. But once you get to the bottom of it and you seek a professional who's able to help you find ways to deal with those things, you'll notice you'll start to feel a little more free. And I will also say that there's nothing emasculating about going to therapy. You can still go to therapy and still maintain your manhood and still be looked at as a man, and you won't have to worry about that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you again, Sammy, for being on the podcast.
Anytime.
And everyone, stay tuned for more empowering episodes on Rough Edges. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Rough Edges podcast with Sarah I. Fox. If you want more updates on the podcast, you can follow on Instagram at rough.edges.podcast, or you can visit the official podcast website at roughedgespodcast.com. Thanks again for listening and have a wonderful day.